Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our third day of Insect Pest Management Week. So today we're going to be focusing on corn. That's going to be the end of our week here, kind of touching on pretty much everything corn related, I guess, for pests. My name is Patrick Wagner. I'll be your moderator here today. And we're going to be having Dr. Adam Varenhorst. He's going to be our speaker discussing the topic of all these corn pests. And a couple things I wanted to mention is um, with the Q&A section there, if you have any questions at all, feel free to throw those into there. Keep an eye on the chat box. I'll be throwing a few things in that related to the any surveys or the CCA credits. Those are available for purchase. Again, that's $30 per week or $200 for the entire series. So yeah, keep an eye on that. Otherwise, Adam, if you want to share your screen, let me get your slides up. We'll see how we're looking. Perfect. All righty. So let's go ahead and get started. Adam, take it away.
All right. Well, thanks, Pat. Well, good morning, everyone. And as Pat said, we're going to talk about some common corn insect pests and kind of an update on some of the research we've done and what we saw and was reported in 2025. So I'm going to start. If you've been here all week, I apologize, but we're going to start with grasshoppers again because, grasshoppers affect pretty much every crop we grow in South Dakota. And so we'd be a little remiss if we didn't cover them again today. But in corn, it's a little bit different story than in some of our other crops as far as grasshoppers go. And the reason for that is corn leaves are maybe not the favorite food option for grasshoppers. They will chew on them, they will defoliate corn leaves, but corn tends to be a little bit harder on their mouth parts, the leaves. And so they tend to go for the areas of the plant that are a little softer, more nutritious as the season goes on. And that can cause some major issues. And so we do have a risk for having some large grasshopper populations present. And the reason for that is we've had issues throughout South Dakota for the last few years. So 2021 pretty much was the start to 2025. We've had these hot spots of grasshopper populations. And then in addition to that, we've had these favorable fall conditions. Now, what's favorable for a grasshopper? Well, we look for periods of drought or drier conditions because grasshoppers like bare soil or drier soil for laying eggs. And something else that's very favorable is warm falls. And essentially, the later that first hard frost, the more grasshopper eggs that will be laid. And as a result, the potential for increased populations during the next years there. And so in 21 to 25, we've had areas of the state, or in some years, large portions of the state that have experienced drought. So that's helped build up some of these grasshopper populations. And we have a lot of potential then, based on all these conditions, that we probably will see some really large populations again in 2026. The issue is that we don't have that magical crystal ball to say this is exactly where they're going to be. We just go off of where we know they were the previous year. We know where the conditions were right, and we try to help pinpoint where the scouting needs to occur. And so in South Dakota, there's three pest species of grasshoppers we primarily scout for. And those from left to right on the screen here are the differential grasshopper. This is a fairly large grasshopper species. They're typically this olive green color. We have a red-legged grasshopper. They're much smaller than these other two species. And entomologists typically name things based on what we see. So they have a portion of their leg is red, so that's where the name comes from. And then there's the two-striped grasshopper, which gets its name because of these two stripes when you're looking down on it on its back. And it also is a fairly large grasshopper species. So between the differential and the two-stripe, those are the largest two that we see most often here in South Dakota in crops. And so, as I mentioned, they will feed on the leaves. You can see some of these leaves here have been heavily defoliated. A large grasshopper population can make corn look pretty tough. But the big issue though is when you start seeing this right here, where we start to see grasshopper populations feeding on the silks, if we see them feeding through the husk and getting into the ear itself. And, in this particular year, this was, I believe, 2021 to 2023, somewhere in that period down in the southeast part of the state. And what we see is that there are a lot of grasshoppers already on this ear. They've already made it through and they're just continuing to feed. And so that is a problem population and needs to be taken care of. Anytime we have an insect feeding directly on in corn, the ear, or in soybean, the pods, whatever crop it is, if it's feeding on the part we need to harvest, the threshold for that gets very, very low because we do not want to have that type of damage present. And so as we get closer to our 2026 grasshopper activity, we can do some steps to try to predict where the spots are going to be, as I mentioned. And we did have some drought conditions in 2025. We actually still have some droughty conditions here in the state right now this winter. And we started off strong in November. I thought we were going to have a ton of snowfall based on, I think in November I scooped more snow than I did all of last year, but things have slowed down a little bit. Maybe they'll pick back up, but for now it looks like uh, we may be a little on the drier side, but things can change a lot. We have a few months. And so there will be areas, as I mentioned, that experience large populations. If you had a grasshopper issue last year and the conditions fit what I'm saying, there's a good chance you're going to see them again. And I mentioned, though, that a lot can change, and those winter and spring conditions can have impacts on the grasshopper populations. And particularly in the winter, we're looking at really cold temperatures. So the next couple of days, without a lot of snow cover. Right now, we do have some snow cover. It's hard to say if it's going to be enough to keep those cold temperatures from penetrating the soil really deep. But one of the things we do know is that when we don't have snow cover and we get really frigid temperatures, that cold air will seep down into the soil. It reaches down, and insects are really tough. They're hardy. A lot of them have the equivalent of antifreeze in their bodies during the winter so that they don't have increased mortality due to the cold conditions. But even that has limits. Just like your antifreeze, they have limits too on how cold they can stand. Now, if we look at the current prediction map for drought, this is what's ongoing right now in the state. So down in the southeast part of the state where we've had, I'd say, a recurring issue with grasshoppers for the last few years, currently moderately drought. And then there's also this large band that's abnormally dry. This abnormally dry fits. We had a lot of grasshopper reports in 2025, kind of in central South Dakota, west of the river. And that's pretty common. That tends to be an increased grasshopper risk area. However, some of the pictures we saw from 2025 suggest that they were, in some places, very large populations. And it's just something that needs to be continually monitored as the season progresses. Now, I mentioned warm, favorable falls can be an issue for us too. And if we look at this map, this shows us all these pretty colors on the state of South Dakota. Really, what it's showing us is the first hard frost date. And so that's any temperatures below 28 degrees Fahrenheit. For entomologists, we'd like to see for reducing some of our grasshopper activity, other insect activity, especially the mosquitoes, we'd really like to see a lot of this map be light blue. And unfortunately, what we see is that it's actually the opposite. We're actually, for the most part, light green to the middle shade of green. We even have some brown. So if we look here over on this key, the lighter green means it was the end of October for that first hard frost. The brown's the first week of November. And so what we see is there's a little bit of variation across the state that's pretty common for South Dakota, but we will have areas where there were much later frosts, and so the grasshoppers had more time to lay those eggs, which will probably translate into larger grasshopper populations if every other condition was favorable for them. So what do we do for grasshopper management? Well, the most important thing is to scout. We get out there in the spring. As soon as crops are starting to emerge, we need to start scouting because we've seen in South Dakota fields that get wiped out for the first 100 to 200 feet in because the grasshoppers moved in from the field edge. So they're either in the road ditch or whatever was next to that field. They move in and they cause a ton of issues early in the season, resulting in the need to replant because 100% loss where they hit. And for the threshold, we're looking at 30 to 45 nips per square yard. in crops, and then 8 adults per square yard for the threshold. And so for the visual counts, what we recommend is that you stand still, you pick an area, you stand still, and you estimate a square yard around yourself. And then you just watch the grasshoppers that are moving in that designated area and you start counting. And then you use that to determine whether or not you're at threshold or not. And if you are at threshold, the recommendation is to use foliar insecticides. With the foliar insecticides, it's really important that we try to manage grasshoppers earlier because the larger a grasshopper gets, if you look on the insecticide label, the rate changes. The recommended rate for that grasshopper will change. And the reason for that, a larger grasshopper is much harder to kill than a smaller grasshopper. And I mentioned the silk clipping. This will come up a couple more times during the talk because that is such a risk for us in terms of reducing yield really quickly. But for grasshoppers, if we have any feeding through the husk, really if you see a lot of grasshoppers on the ears, that warrants consideration for treatment by itself. But if you have feeding on the husk, through the husk, it's time to spray. We want to try to avoid having them actually feed through the husk because that'll open that ear up for other insects and pathogens. We also want to make sure the silks aren't being clipped within a half inch of the tip. And the reason for that is that's really necessary for the pollination. And if pollination is less than 50% complete. So if you meet those criteria, it's time to spray for grasshoppers feeding on those plants in July and August. We're going to switch gears now to corn rootworm. This is probably our historically most serious pest for corn in South Dakota. So it's both the northern corn rootworm, which are the green beetles, and then the western corn rootworm, which are slightly larger. They're yellow, and then they have these black lines. And then sometimes the lines bleed together, but there's some sort of black pattern on those hardened forewings. So for both species of rootworm, the adults are typically not a major economic issue for us. It's the larvae because the larvae are feeding on the roots. If you get a lot of feeding on the roots, you're going to have reduced water and nutrient uptake. If you have really serious feeding, as we see occasionally, you also have reduced standability, so you get lodging and can be a whole issue when it comes to harvest. And here actually is some pictures of the western corn rootworm. We typically don't see the larva. The reason for that is if you look here, this is the brace root. They're quite small. And so this is a heavily infested plant from one of our plots. And we typically will see the adults when they start emerging, but the larvae are typically, we know they were there based on what we see with the root tissue, but under heavy infestation, sometimes the populations are large enough you can pull a plant out and actually start seeing them. Otherwise, something else you can do if you're interested to see if injury was due to these rootworm larvae or not, and you're on the fence, you can do what we refer to as float the roots, where you submerge them in water. These larvae do not like water, and so they will start to try to get back up to the surface because they need oxygen too. And then you can count and kind of get an idea of what the larvae look like. But we typically do not do that unless we're just trying to see if we have pressure or, in some cases, determine whether or not we're ready to start digging the corn roots. So the life cycle for both species is very similar for the northern and the western. Right now, as of sometime this fall, the eggs are in the soil. So the eggs were laid by the adults and they're in the soil and they're going to remain in the soil until things warm up and the corn is planted and starts emerging. So there's a little bit of variation and you'll notice there's overlap on some of the things here. And that's because every year is a little bit different. So the weather's never exactly the same. These are dependent on soil temperature to an extent. And so if it's a little bit cooler spring, things will be delayed. If a little warmer, they may be a little bit advanced. But for the most part, we've been doing corn rootworm research for a few years now. And before us, it's been done for 20 plus years here in South Dakota. For the most part, it seems like emergence for the adults is sometime at the beginning, mid to beginning of August. We'll start to see populations typically the second week of July, and then it really ramps up. And so, and it'll continue. The adults will be active until the first hard frost. And the big population issue, though, with this, as I mentioned, the adults aren't too much of an issue. It's the larvae. So the larvae are active pretty much that from when the plants emerge until they pupate and emerge as adults. So they have quite a bit of time to feed. And as a result, it gives them a lot of opportunities to damage the plants. When scouting for corn rootworm, there are two methods that we typically recommend. The first is going to be the more labor-intensive option. And this is where we actually go out and we dig corn roots and look for the larval injury. This needs to be done from July, that mid-July point on. So it should be started after you start to see the corn rootworm adults emerging, because that tells you that the injury is going to be down there and you'll actually get a good idea of what was going on at the beginning of the season. If you dig too early, the larvae may still be in the plant and you may underestimate the injury that's actually occurring. And so for this, you go out and you pick random roots, you dig them. You should try to spread out throughout the field. We dig a lot of corn roots each year from our research plots. It is quite labor intensive, and it's good cardio. It's a good workout, but by the end of the day, you definitely were out in the field, and you typically are hoping to have something else to do the next day. Once you dig them, though, we typically recommend soaking them. This is what we do ourselves. We use a water tank. We soak them for 10 to 15 minutes. We try to shake as much of the dirt off as possible, and then we wash the roots. We use a low-powered pressure washer. So you can see some of the employees here, they tie it so the handle's constantly on, and they just slowly spin that root around, trying to get as much of the dirt off as possible. Now, you don't necessarily have to be as thorough as us. We're trying to get very precise, but this is probably the quickest way to get the soil off so you can actually see that feeding if it's present. And then you examine the root nodes 4, 5, and 6. So 6 is right below the brace root. And so imagine it goes 6, 5, 4 as you're looking towards the bottom of the root mass. And so what we ideally would see is a lot of roots that look like the one that my employee's holding here, where they're nice and fairly pristine. There's not a lot of discoloration due to the scarring, and there's quite a bit of root material there. That indicates that those are pretty healthy roots. And, the healthy versus the not so healthy, if we look here, this would be a troubled plant. And so what we see here is that we're missing a lot of our root material. It's just gone. The darker colored roots, that's due to the insect feeding. So the rootworm larvae, when they feed on the root tissue, they open it up, and so you get the discoloration, that scarring occurring because the plant's trying to heal itself, and also you're letting a few other things in at that time. And so we don't want to see plants that look like this. That's a worst case scenario. Once you get your roots ready and you're looking at your correct nodes, so the 4, 5, 6, you're going to look for apparent root feeding. And so you're looking for nodes that are destroyed or partial nodes to within 1.5 inches of the stalk. So we don't typically use a ruler. We can estimate it pretty closely, but you're looking for the ones like the picture shows here that are obviously pruned back, and then you count how many of those roots around the node are present, and then how many are uh, completely cut back, so clipped. And so if you have no apparent feeding, you're at a rating of 0. You should have no yield loss due to rootworms. If you get a rating of 1 to 1.9, you're looking at somewhere in the ballpark of 15% yield loss. You may have some lodging and goosenecking, but you're just going to see a little bit of a yield drag. And so I skipped here because we can all do the math. A rating of 2 would be from 2 to 2.9. You'd be looking at about 30% yield loss. And a rating of 3, you have 2 or more of the nodes that you were looking at gone. And this is typically, I joke, but it's true. If you go out to one of these fields, you don't need your spade, because when you grab that plant, it's going to essentially be removed from the soil. If you give them any sort of pull, uh, you don't need to dig them up because there's just nothing holding them into the soil. A rating of 3, though, is about 45% yield loss, and you're going to have a lot of symptoms. So you're probably looking at some stunting, lodging, goosenecking. One of the obvious things, though, is you will see a lot of beetles in those fields. It's going to be pretty obvious that there's an issue. And I'll show another picture for what a rating of 3 looks like, I believe, here in a minute, so we can look at what the ears look like. But the second scouting method, if I had to choose, this one's probably the more feasible of the two, depending on what your season looks like and how many fields you have to scout. But Uh, this is using yellow sticky cards. So these are the trace unbaited sticky cards. They cost currently $1.84 each. And we typically look at online at places like Gimplers, and I'm not endorsing Gimplers. It's just there's not too many places that sell these anymore. And what you do is you pick a few places out in the field. You can see they come with these little ties. You tie them right onto the plant, and then you mark where that is so that you can find it again later. And you come back a week later and you replace it. And you keep doing that until we get to the end of August. And what you do is you just look at each card as you pull them out each week and you count the number of rootworm adults on the card. Anytime you hit two adults, and it doesn't matter the species, as long as it's a rootworm, you're at threshold. And this is typically a little bit quicker. It's not, I'm not going to say it's pain-free. You have to wear gloves because if you get the sticky material, the tangle trap that's on these cards on your hands, you're going to get it everywhere, and it is very difficult to get rid of. Uh, it's just kind of a pain that way, but otherwise it does speed up the scouting quite a bit. The other issue you run into, and we hear stories about this, is people forget where they put the card and then they find them when they're harvesting. So there are some catches. It's not going to be free and easy, but it's a lot quicker than digging the corn's roots. And so, as I mentioned, this is what a rating of 3 looks like. This is our infield during the season pictures for really serious injury from the corn rootworm. And it brings up the next point too, though, is that when there is a problem and we're scouting and we figure out that, whoa, we have a bad population, we have a lot of root feeding, we can't do anything. That's the unfortunate part of managing corn rootworms is there are no in-season emergency rescues for the larva. Once that seed is in the ground, we better have our best foot forward in terms of management because we're not going to find out how we did until we get into July and we start to see some of those signs and we get to the end of the season and see what yield looks like. Those really severely infested fields, a lot of times you will get small ears, and that's just due to the fact that there's a lot of nutrient flow issue and water issues. But the lodging is also a major issue. We've seen fields where some during a wind event hits and there was enough rootworm pressure, the entire field will go down and results in the field having to get combined one direction. And those are things we want to try to avoid in addition just to the yield loss. So I did say a couple times that the adults typically aren't too much of an issue, but there are situations in which the adults can become a problem. It's typically when we have those very large populations because adult rootworms will feed on the silks, they'll clip them, they'll feed on the tassels, on the pollen, and so they can cause their own issues. If we do have that occur, foliar insecticides can be very effective when they're applied at the right time. For the rootworm, it's pretty similar to the grasshoppers, except we say if there's 5 or more beetles per ear, that can trigger a spray. In addition, if the silks are clipped to within a half inch of the tip of the husk, and you have less than 50% pollination. So if those are present, then it's time to spray. Now there is a catch because we've had some reports in the last couple of years of potential field failures for spraying rootworm adults. If you are using an in-furrow insecticide at plant, there are quite a few options. We'll go through some of them in a few slides. But one of the big things is that we want to make sure we are not using the same active ingredient and preferably not even the same class of insecticide for the at plant and then the beetle spraying. So the adult spraying should use a completely different insecticide than what was used at the beginning of the season. The issue is if we already exposed the larva to the insecticide and they survived, there's a chance that there's some resistance developing in that population. And then if we spray out the adults, if there were any susceptible individuals, we've removed them, and all we're left with are the resistant individuals. And so we're encouraging that resistant population to compete and increase and thrive. So we want to try to make sure we keep those products that we do have working. So next I'm going to show you guys will notice on these graphs, it's 2024. We're still going through our 2025 data. But we have a summary of a few years of corn rootworm data here. So first, we're just going to look at the total captures, and these are from a few of our research sites in here in the eastern side of the state. And I'm going to break each one out, though, so it's a little bit easier to see. And so we have the two bars. The light orange here represent the western corn rootworm, and then the light green are the northern corn rootworm. And what we see is that we've had at the our location here near Bruce, South Dakota, you'll notice we had pretty low populations in 2019 and 2020. What actually was occurring there is that this was not being used for research. This was just being managed conventionally. And then we started using it for research. So we've actually, you can see once you start going corn on corn, there can be a pretty quick increase in terms of rootworm pressure. But what we think is the most interesting, we see this pretty often, is that the longer you are going with corn on corn, you start to see a shift in your corn rootworm populations. So initially, we actually had more northerns than the westerns, and then we start to see that paradigm shift. And so the longer we are doing corn on corn, we start to notice that the western corn rootworms become more prevalent, and the population seems to shift towards them over the northerns. But the population also, this shows us that we did have a little bit of a decrease in 2024, and that's pretty much across the board from what I saw. And we believe that was just due to some of those spring conditions. So spring weather can also affect corn rootworms. Near our Bryant location, this has been long-term corn on corn in these plots. And so we aren't too surprised. We see that it's pretty much at this point all western corn rootworms. When we go out in the field in the summer, we hardly see any northern corn rootworms out in this area. It's almost 100% at this point, the western corn rootworm. What you also notice though is that, corn rootworm populations can vary from year to year. We occasionally have very good years. Some years are not as good. And then we have years where the population essentially disappears. And what happened in 2024 is this particular site had a lot of rain, so it was very wet. And if it's wet when the rootworm larvae are active in the soil, we can actually get to a point where they drown. In addition, the field got hit by hail, and so the overall food resources for these rootworm were just essentially zero by the time we got into mid-July. And so that did crash the population, and it's still not fully recovered yet as of 2025. So there are things that will crash rootworm populations. It is possible. Uh, it is a good point. I should also mention that if you rotate away for a long enough period of time, that should also greatly reduce your populations. So for our Coleman location, pretty much the same trend. The long-term corn on corn, the western population's prevalent, and we saw some fluctuation again. So a wetter spring resulted in a little bit reduced population. And then also I should mention for the Cavor location, pretty similar. But the main message here is that your rootworm populations will fluctuate. Now, ideally, you won't have this large populations out in your field because we're sampling a very small area and we're getting a lot of beetles. But the takeaway is that you should probably be monitoring your rootworm populations year to year, just to kind of have an idea and allow you to change management and increase and decrease input costs based on what you're seeing from the previous year's numbers. We're going to look at the daily rootworm capture numbers then just to get an idea for each location, if we were at threshold or not. Remember, 2 per day is threshold. So for our Bruce location, we definitely have hit it for the last few years. In some cases, we've been way over it. And then looking at our Bryant location, we were quite high in terms of going over that 2 per day threshold until we hit the less favorable weather conditions that caused our population to crash. And Coleman was pretty similar. In 2024, we were actually slightly below. And then in Cavor, we are still above in 2024. They didn't get all the moisture. So the reason I was showing all of that, though, I'm going to show a couple of the results from we refer to it as our general study. It's where we do an efficacy evaluation for in-furrow treatments. And so these are the 2024 results for our Cavor location. The UTC here represents the untreated control. And then what we'll see here as we go down, we'll just look at all the different treatments. Some of these are still coded. We do not have, those are industry experimental products, so we don't have the names of those. But some of these are currently labeled, and so we can look at those. And what we'll look at is the stand counts. which typically we don't see a lot of variation. There'll be a little bit, but not anything that stands out. Root ratings, percent lodging, and then yield. Those are the main factors we want to look at, and we compare everything to the untreated control. And what we see for our, we jumped, nothing with the stand counts stood out for us. For our root ratings in 2024, and remember this is where almost all of our locations had reduced rootworm pressure. Cavor still had some pretty good pressure. We are at a 1.9, so we were looking at 15% yield loss, just about into that 30% yield loss. And what we see is that the treatments greatly reduced the root rating. So we saw a reduction in injury across the board with the treatments. And so it's important to note that although some treatments are still a little bit lower, like the Force Evo, nothing would stand out if you're trying to look at the economics. And so in some cases, it's important to essentially look at what your inputs are going to be and choose the product that's going to help you with your bottom dollar the most. For percent lodging, nothing stood out too much. We didn't have a lot of lodging in 2024, even in our untreated control. And then when we looked at yield, this is the part that uh, we were not super surprised because we were only looking at maybe 15% yield loss. And so we didn't see anything that really stood out significantly. Nothing did, but numerically, we did have a few treatments that yielded a little better. And so the problem there is that we don't have confidence that that would be routine. So the other thing is that when you see a researcher put numbers up and there aren't letters next to it, that means there's a lot of variation. And that's why we can't tease apart the statistics. And so that suggests that there's probably overlap across a lot of these numbers from one another. And so next I'm going to show the 2024 Coleman. We didn't actually collect from the Bryant location in 2024 just because there was nothing to collect after the hailstorms. But from our Coleman location, what we noticed is pretty much the same story, except we did have a lot lower root rating in our untreated control. So we were less than a note of injury. And as a result, we didn't see any other effects. So management for corn rootworm, I know, is very tricky because most of you have already probably, if you are a farmer, you've purchased your seed, you're making decisions for in-furrow treatments. You have a little bit more time on that, but uh, your rootworm populations will fluctuate. Spring conditions can affect that, but unfortunately, a lot of times those conditions don't show up until after we've already planted. And so the best thing we can do in terms of trying to decide what to do for management is look at the previous year pressure by doing either the root digs or collecting those adults on the sticky cards and try to decide whether or not management's going to help us with our return or if it's just going to be an input cost that doesn't really benefit us. But year to year, there are fields. So these are long-term corn on corn, as I mentioned, with a lot of rootworm pressure. But we still get reports of your average field that still gets a lot of pressure too. So uh, just wanted to show some of our data to show that we are still working on this problem. And one of the best things, unfortunately, we're probably a month or so late on this, is this handy BT trait table. And I recommend if you already have your seed purchased, that's fine. But for the upcoming years, I recommend using this resource to help you select the traits that are going to give you your best management of insect pests in corn. And so this is compiled by two researchers. One of them is at the university at Texas A&M University, Pat Porter, and the other is Chris DeFonso at Michigan State University. And so Chris does most of the work on this in terms of putting the table together, but it's a lot of work, but it's a great resource. And we use this all the time and double checking when we're trying to decide what traits we want to put where or for an experiment. And so I put the websites right here. This is how you get to it at the texasinsects.org. Make sure you have everything here that's necessary to find it. You can Google it. It will take a few more steps, a few extra clicks to get there. But if we look here, they have a lot of tables on the website. What we typically want to look at is the table 2 because that's the current trait packages available in the US. They also have a table that shows the legacy trait packages, but most of those are not going to be getting marketed right now. But if we look here, you look at the name of the trait package. If you're looking at the label, they also have the codes here. and then it shows you what traits are present. What's also nice is then from the traits that are present, because we don't all have those memorized, you will go through here and it will show you which insects there's resistance to. If it still is effective, it'll have an X. If it's resistant, the insect that is resistant, it'll have an R. If there's localized resistance, an RL. But you can go through and kind of tease apart. If you see the R or the RL, feel free to contact me. We can visit about if it's an issue in South Dakota. But for the most part, everything still works pretty good here. And so it also tells you what type of refuge it requires, which anymore is pretty much the refuge in a bag, and also will tell you what weed control traits it has. So it's a really great resource for helping figure out what traits you want and making sure that it still fits in your weed control strategies. And so I highly recommend taking a look and maybe using that in the future. As we look for corn rootworm, kind of at our BT options, what we see is that we have a few traits here. There's five total packages that are available for corn rootworm. And unfortunately, though, if we start digging into them a little bit, there's going to be some issues. In South Dakota, we don't have any direct reports of complete failures, but we do around us. And so a lot of locations have had issues with corn rootworms overcoming the different BT traits. And so when we're looking for corn rootworm management for the upcoming season, it's very important that we consider avoiding single genes. And so the reason for that is the single genes historically have not been working as great. They've been out for quite a few years, and so there's a greater risk for the rootworm surviving on them. Based on the issues around us, we also recommend avoiding pyramids containing the Cry3BP1, Cry3435AB1, or the eCry3.1AB proteins, because there are documented cases of resistance in our neighboring states. And this is I know I've visited with a lot of people about this, but we also do not recommend using a BT trait plus soil applied insecticides. And you might be thinking, well, that would give us our best chance of management, though, right? Because BT should knock out a large part of the insect population, and the soil applied insecticide should clean up anything else that's left. That's true, but then there's the catch of that is that if there is the chance that you have a corn rootworm that has resistance to the BT and is developing resistance to the soil applied insecticides. In those situations, if we keep using it, we're creating essentially not a super bacteria, but a super bug, super insect that's going to not be able to be managed with anything we currently have. In some cases, the soil applied insecticides, we can rotate the class, but we want to try to keep those products all working as well as possible. So it also comes down to also the input cost. So if you're choosing one, try to choose one or the other, not both. And so these are the products that are commercially available right now. If you took my advice to avoid those individual proteins and pyramids containing them, unfortunately, you'd probably not use any of these. And so take that with a grain of sand. Those recommendations are based on what we've been seeing from other states, but we do still have efficacy with these products here in South Dakota. The big thing is if you are using any of these products, make sure you're scouting, make sure you detect if there's a population that seems to be surviving. It's time to rotate to something different. And so the options are crop rotations for management. Uh, it's important occasionally to get a rotation in. Now in South Dakota, we do have the northern corn rootworm that have extended diapause. And so that means that even if we rotate, we go to soybeans and go back to corn and back and forth, they've adapted to be able to just stay in the ground and they wait for the corn to come back. And so typically the longer rotations are more beneficial. But again, I understand that doesn't always fit into every person's plan in terms of farming, but that's just what the research shows us. If we have mild to moderate pressure in a field, the BT should work fine. If you have really high pressure, uh, maybe consider trying an in-furrow instead of the BT and knock the population down a little bit, hopefully, and then go to something else the next year. Maybe switch to the BT or rotate the crop. So we do still have options. And Our data show that even with very large populations, you still can get management. I think that's the key takeaway with that data that didn't have a lot of significant differences. Even though we didn't have that, we did still see some benefit to those treatments. Now I'm going to switch gears off of corn rootworm finally. I'm sure you guys are all relieved, but we're going to continue on corn insects, but now we're going to talk about the European corn borer. And so the European corn borer historically was a major problem for us in corn, and it kind of disappeared. I'm sure a lot of you realize that we don't deal with it quite as much as they did in the past. The reason it kind of disappeared was that we got BT hybrids. The BT hybrids were, in this case, essentially a silver bullet. But things are changing. We do still see and get reports of European corn borer. It's in South Dakota so far. It's been in conventional corn. Uh, the catch is that there are uh, biotypes of the European corn borer that have been detected in parts of the US that are overcoming the BT hybrid. We don't have those in South Dakota yet, but that's something that we need to start watching for. And so, unfortunately, we have to dig out the old slides on the European corn borer and start talking about it again because we don't want to be caught off guard. Now, the moths are fairly small. They're kind of a drab brown to a light cream color with light brown markings. And the caterpillars, we don't typically see them, but they're a light brown color with a dark brown head, and they have these lighter spots on their bodies. These are typically going to be in the stalk when they're present. And so we actually are looking for signs of the European corn borer feeding on the plant. And so the larvae will feed on the leaves. The eggs are laid on the leaves. They hatch. The larvae have to start feeding right away. They're hungry. The entire time, though, the larvae are moving from the leaves up to the whorl. That's the goal is to get to the whorl because from the whorl, they're going to feed down into the stalk. First signs of injury, if you don't catch the egg masses, are going to be what we refer to as window pane injury. And those caterpillars are really small, so even though they're hungry, they can't feed through the leaf. As a result, they're stripping layers of the epidermis off. In some cases, they'll strip enough off that the leaf gets kind of a translucent layer left, and you can kind of see, and that's why we refer to it as window pane injury. The other type of injury that's going to be an indicator that you have a European corn borer population present in the field is looking at the newest leaves. If you start to notice these perfectly straight line of holes, we call that shot hole injury because it almost looks like a shotgun pellet went through. And that happens because they're feeding on that leaf as it's still curled up in the whorl. As it expands, then we get the nice straight line of holes. But that's an indicator that the caterpillar was at the whorl. Hopefully we caught it pretty quickly because by the time we see this and there's already a lot of new leaves, that means that caterpillar is down in the stalk. And so to scout for European corn borer, we typically recommend using degree day accumulation because that can help us pinpoint when we need to really be scouting for egg masses and when treatment would be necessary if we're trying to spray these. And so the big thing is we need to capture the first spring moth. That's the most accurate method for calculating the degree days. We call that a biofix. The other option is to just go from January 1, and it's not as accurate, but it works. The problem is you need blacklight traps to catch European corn borers, and we don't have an extensive network here in South Dakota, so it makes it a little bit trickier for us to try to get that biofix. But if you're doing that, once you catch the moth, you start accumulating degree days after that. A degree day is your high temperature for the day minus the low temperature divided by 2, and then you subtract from that the developmental threshold. And so at the end of the day, it's essentially average temperature minus developmental threshold. And uh, the developmental threshold for the European corn borer, I currently have that in Celsius. I apologize. But it's, I believe about, what is that, about 48 degrees. Pat or Phil, you can chime in. You can Google that quick and let me know. But that's what you're doing. So you essentially each day you go through after we capture the first spring moth or from January 1, you're calculating the average temperature minus the temperature the insect needs to develop. And you then add those numbers up. So the result that you get from this, you start adding those up and you use this to compare to the table. And so What we see is that at zero, we had no accumulated degree days. We caught the first moth. Once the moth is captured, we start calculating. And so when we get to 212 degree days, that means the eggs are hatching, the larvae are active, and you start to get that pinhole, or you're going to get that window pane injury. And then as we go, we start to see that the larvae those caterpillars are growing. When we get to 567, uh, that's when we for sure have stock boring. When we're at 435, they're making their way into the stock. And so you can imagine that when management's being discussed, we want to try to catch them about here. So the 318 to 435 is kind of a crucial point. The research that's been done on the European corn borers was very thorough. There was a lot of research done because it was an issue for so many years. We even have an estimate from when you hit a degree day to when you typically, and this is going to be based on some of the states to the south of us, but you'll have an estimate for about how many days that takes. The best, of course, is to actually go through and calculate and make sure that it's accurate. But uh, again, management's a very short window for this insect. Now, that was for the first generation. In South Dakota, we can have two generations of European corn borer depending on which part of the state you're in. And I don't have the figure up here because it's not perfect, but essentially imagine that between uh, the north side of South Dakota and the south side, there's a line, kind of goes at an angle, and that's going to be our line for where we see the first to second generation. The further north you are, one generation. The further south you are, the greater the risk for the second generation. There's going to be a lot of seasonality to that because when you have an imaginary line going through the state, that obviously isn't exact. And so you're going, if it's a ideal year, a lot of more areas are going to have two generations than if it's maybe a later spring and things are a little slower. It's a little cooler year. Maybe Canada has wildfires and the smoke's cooling things off. That's going to slow down the development. As a result, we probably will have more areas with just one generation. But very much the same. You're calculating those degree days to figure out when they're active. The big difference is you'll see the degree day numbers are much higher. When scouting for European corn borer, uh, it's a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of time to go through and do this because you need to look at 5 sets of 20 plants, so 100 plants per field per sampling date. And so this is why nobody likes the European corn borer. It is a very time-intensive management just for scouting. And then what you're going to do is you're going to record the percentage of those plants that have whorl feeding. You're going to dissect 2 damaged plants and record the larva. And then you're going to count the larva by life stage. So again, very time intensive. There's a lot of work that has to be done. When trying to make management decisions, the University of Illinois has this table. This is still accurate, even though it's from quite a few years ago. And what you do is you take the results from your scouting and you start inputting it here. And you'll see there's some stuff that's going to be kind of hard to figure out. And essentially, some of these are going to be estimates or they're going to be calculated further earlier on in the table. And so the idea though is that you're going to get down to the end here and it's going to tell you whether or not you can treat and whether or not you're going to save money or lose money by treating for this pest. Something I also always like to note is that if you manage this pest, pretty much the best level of management we get is 80%. Now that's with granules, because you need to get those down into the whorl to where those caterpillars are trying to make their way down into the stalk. And so management of this pest is not 100%. So what else can we do since spraying isn't a great option and it's going to require a lot of extra effort? Well, we should still be scouting, but one of the things you can do is make sure you're not the first or last corn planted in a neighborhood. And I know I grew up on a farm. I understand when you see one planter in the field, that there's a strong urge to get out in the field as well. But sometimes it's best to let your neighbors get their corn in first and then make sure you're not the last person either. If you have infested fields, harvest them as early as possible when they're ready. And another option is not to till in the fall, because fall tillage will actually help bury those larvae that are going to be in the stalk. and they're not going to be exposed to cold temperatures. Now, years ago, everybody had a stock chopper. They'd run that through the field, they'd bale the field up. Things have changed a lot since that period in the 90s because we're trying to leave a lot of residue out in the field. And, I don't see a lot of people still running stock choppers in the fall. But the idea with the stock chopper is you destroy the stalks and you increase the chances of those caterpillars being exposed to cold temperatures. When it comes to management, foliar insecticides can work, but the granulars will probably be better still. And products that are legal to apply are going to be a big thing because things keep changing with our registrations for products. But make sure it's labeled, make sure you can still use it, and then dig up some of the older work or contact me and we can discuss it. We're going to go through, we have just a few minutes left, so we're going to go through some less important corn insect pests. They can still be a headache. The first is the common stalk borer. Now, we typically do not see these caterpillars, and a lot of times in the season, we won't even know these are out in the field. But the common stalk borer caterpillar is pretty unique in appearance. It has an orange head. We call this the purple saddle. And the reason I say we typically don't notice these is these are almost exclusive to the edge of the field. So the indrows will have the injury from this, and in some cases it's very minor. But if you're walking on the edge of the field and you start to notice that you have raggedy looking leaves, there's a good chance you have common stalk borer. These move into the field once they get too large for the weedy hosts that they're feeding on in the road ditches or grass waterways. They move into the corn, they start feeding on the leaf, and then they essentially will make it down into the whorl. And so, almost exclusively an issue on field borders. A lot of times, if management's necessary, one pass around the edge of the field or even one boom is enough to reduce the impact of this pest. Younger corn is more susceptible. Once we get a little bit later in the season, we don't have as much of an issue. One of the issues, aside from the point that they just make the corn a little ragged, they can cause dead heart. So where they hit the growing point, and then you end up with wilting, dying plants. So to scout for this, you look at 30 random plants in the border rows from May to June. If you see the raggedy feeding, what I typically recommend to do, because there's a good chance that plant's already done based on that caterpillar being present, is pull the whorl out and you just start unrolling it. And eventually you'll start to see the sawdust like excrement, and then eventually you'll find that caterpillar down there. Now, the economic thresholds for these, you can see this is a little outdated based on the current price of corn, but in 2010, they put together this table, and it's still somewhat relevant just because it gives you an idea that it isn't always going to be feasible to manage these. You need to really have a severe issue. A lot of times in conversations, one of the things that comes up is maybe you're renting and you have a landlord that likes the farm to look nice, and you don't want to have the common stalk borer affecting the indrows. It just depends. Every situation is a little different, but at the end of the day, you're looking at not a ton of yield loss unless you start to, like I said, get that dead heart. And then what you need though is look at the percentage of infested plants out of those ones you scouted, and that tells you whether or not management would be feasible. Again, you typically only have to manage the indrows or part of the indrows. One of the big things for this pest is it can be avoided simply by leaving weeds a little bit longer in the spring. So you get everything planted, and the next step, maybe you want to start your weed management a little early. And unfortunately, the recommendation around the edge of a cornfield would be to just wait. And the reason for that is if you kill those weedy hosts that are around the edge, so you have the caterpillars present, but they're in the weeds and they're happy and they're fine. If you spray the weeds and they start to dry down, the caterpillars will leave early and move into the corn sooner. One of the issues is we do have to catch these when they're moving and they're not already down in the whorl. And so we do put out degree day estimates based on that to help everybody each year try to figure out when this is going to be active. But like I said, typically 4 to 6 rows is all that needs to be treated. The next pest is the black cutworm. Now, these are somewhat sporadic. We occasionally do have issues with them in South Dakota. They get their name because the caterpillar has a black, dark appearance. They typically have kind of a rough texture on the skin. And they also get their name because they cut plants. So these migrate from the southern US each year in the spring. So if we have a lot of strong southerly winds, that's going to increase our risk for black cutworm injury. It also tends to bring up a lot of other moth pest pressure in terms of like the true armyworm. But we monitor those southerly winds and then we start scouting. Females are more attracted to wet, weedy fields. So that can also be an issue. We actually had a lot of issues back in 2019 with cutworms, and that was because it was the wet spring. So conditions were just favorable. And so to scout for these, look at 20 plants throughout a field. If you have 5% of the seedlings that are cut, if they're laying like the picture shows here, where they're cut and starting to wilt on the ground, or if you notice leaf feeding and you scout in the soil and you see that there's some caterpillars present, it's time to spray. Management for these can be accomplished through the BT Cry1F protein. Uh, Foliar insecticides, if they're being used, need to be applied later in the day because these are nocturnal feeders. Next pest is one that seems to show up a lot here in South Dakota. It's the red-headed flea beetle. These typically don't show up in fields until sometime in July. Kind of that mid to in July is when we typically notice a lot of pressure. They have a dark red head and a black body. They get their name because they have modified hind legs and they can jump long distances. They'll feed small holes in the leaves, giving it this kind of pinhole appearance. If you get a lot of them, they can cause some defoliation, but the other issue is they will feed on the silk. So if you have a lot of flea beetles present, you can get some silk clipping occurring. And so it's essentially the same threshold as for the corn rootworm, 5 or more beetles per ear, silk clipping, less than 50% pollination. And then I had to add this one in. So we've never had to cover Western bean cutworm here in South Dakota because I never get reports of Western bean cutworm, but I did in 2025. And so this should be on everybody's radar as we go into 2026. And I'll explain why, but they're a medium-sized brown moth. The moths will have a light brown circle, and then below that is a brown comma, sometimes also referred to as a bean. But they're a light tan caterpillar. They have two rectangles that are directly behind the head that are divided by a white line. Just kind of your average run-of-the-mill light tan caterpillar. The reason that I'm a little concerned with this pest is that, like I said, we've never had an issue with it. It's not a common observation in South Dakota. Caterpillars will feed on the tassels, silks, and ears. Research has shown that an average of one caterpillar per ear can equal about 4 bushel per acre loss. And like I said, not a common issue in South Dakota, but in 2025, it was found in a cornfield. There was a pretty large population, and it was found feeding on Cry1F corn. And so this is the first report of this in South Dakota. Historically, we have not had an issue. However, looking at other states, this Cry1F breakdown has been going on with the Western bean cutworm for years, especially down in Nebraska. One of my theories is that maybe those strong southerly winds we had in 2025 spring blew some of the moths that we typically don't see up into South Dakota, and as a result, we had pressure. This should still be managed viably through the VIP3A protein in corn, but we will have to start investigating that a little bit further. So management can also be accomplished with foliar insecticides, but you need to spray when egg masses are in the whorl, and again, that requires quite a bit of scouting. So please keep an eye out for Western bean cutworm. If you come across caterpillars feeding on the ear that don't look like corn earworm, please give me a call. And so to conclude today's talk, some things to consider. Scouting is still key for management of insect pests. We need to be out in the field. That's our best way to know what's active and what's going on. Rootworms will probably be a widespread issue again in 2026 unless we get a lot of adverse conditions in the spring. Uh, uh, numbers are probably going to be fine. And then make sure we also monitor for these other insect pests. If you see anything though that's unusual, you aren't sure what it is, uh, you have something survive where you don't think it should, please contact us at SDSU. We're always happy to help, and that also helps inform us on where some issues may be developing. So I have a few additional slides to show you that are provided by the USDA and SDSU Extension. And if you need to contact me, if you have anything show up, feel free. You can either deliver it to the plant diagnostic lab. The samples will get delivered to me eventually. Uh, I get to see those too. Otherwise, you can give me a call. You can send me an email. You can send me a picture of the insect you're seeing, or I can come out and take a look, whatever works best for you. But we're always happy to help. So, with that, I will turn things back over and thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. So everyone, I've added some things into the chat there. Those are links to the pin for the CCA credits if that's something you want to do. And then I've also included an end of week survey. That's we just wrapped up our insect week, so if you want to fill that out, I'd appreciate that. I have a poll to launch. A couple questions there, so please fill that out as well. So I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A. We'll give people maybe a little bit of time if they do have any questions there. Adam, I have a question for you, and this goes back to corn rootworm. So you mentioned crop rotation and the like issues with extended diapause being a challenge there. So, I mean, I know I've heard about like the soybean variant of corn rootworm that they'll actually lay eggs in soybean fields. It sounds like that's more of an issue in states to the east of us. But have you heard anything of that? I mean, those that soybean variant in South Dakota, and to what extent? And do you think like would longer rotations be able to fix that, or are they just going to find soybean fields no matter what?
That's a good question, Pat. Thanks for it. So far, to our knowledge, we do not have the soybean variant here in South Dakota. So it is marching westward, but to our knowledge, it's not here in South Dakota yet. It started down in Illinois, so you can imagine it had a ways to go. Uh, but insects do travel, they fly, and so they move around from year to year. Uh, in terms of management, and this is kind of for any of our insect pests that dwell in the soil, the longer we get a rotation. So if we can add small grains to a rotation in addition to the soybean and just keep adding a year between the crop, that's always going to benefit us. Because in the soybean variant, from my understanding, it's very specific to a corn soybean rotation. And so if we get that, one of the things we could do in South Dakota, because we do have uh, a pretty strong market for oats and also just a lot of acres still being grown for oats and wheat, we could switch to something like that probably, uh, and maybe reduce its impact. And kind of the same thing from my understanding with that extended diapause northern corn rootworm, because uh, they're looking at kind of a specific timeline, and in some cases they're probably detecting when the corn is out in the field, but uh, we haven't done anything to really monitor for where that is, in recent years. And so it's hard to say it's probably, widespread. But as you saw in those graphs, the northern corn rootworms, if we get a western corn rootworm population established, we essentially see the northern corn rootworms disappear. So we aren't as worried about that extended diapause northern as we maybe were historically, just because the pressure just isn't there compared to the western corn rootworms.
Got it. Excellent. Well, thank you for that. Again, yeah, it doesn't look like any other questions coming through the Q&A. Just wanted to thank everybody for joining us this week for Insect Week. Feel free to join next week. Oh, nope, we just had another question pop up. Any issues with Japanese beetles this past year? Maybe not so much, I guess, maybe corn related.
Sure. Well, we haven't seen nearly the pressure in South Dakota. Pat and I used to both be at Iowa State at one point in time, and there was a period of time where the Japanese beetles down there were, I mean, they were atrocious in the beans and the corn. I have not seen populations that look like that here in South Dakota. uh, especially not in our cornfields, but we do have Japanese beetles established in areas of the state. So far, they still seem to be more of an urban issue, although I believe it was Phil, was it this year or last year, did observe some Japanese beetles in soybean fields. And so the big thing with the Japanese beetles is that they need grass, uh, and so they typically, from what we've seen, they like to be in areas where there's grass available for the larva, and as a result, the populations tend to get worse in urban areas or at research farms because we have a lot of grass driveways. But uh, we would I don't think we would say we currently have a major issue in our crops, but they're definitely in some areas are beginning to be more of an urban issue. Definitely an issue for some gardens.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely one to keep an eye out for. Yeah, so thank you for that question. And as I was saying, next week will be plant pathology week. So that's everything plant diseases. Should be a good show next week. So you're welcome to join us for that. Otherwise, thanks everybody for hopping on and have a great day.